Hi everyone, my name is Tejasvi. I'm a partner solution architect supporting IBM AMER region. Joining me, we have Ryan Nix, who will also co-present part of the session today. I would like to take a moment and talk to you about the Red Hat OpenShift service on AWS, which is ROSA, but specifically for IBM Maximo customers. So with the latest version of IBM Maximo, it has a dependency of being containerized workload running on top of OpenShift. So many of the customers that are running IBM Maximo are either going through a migration from an older version of Maximo to this newer containerized version running on top of OpenShift, or they may be combining that with running a migration from wherever they are currently into AWS. So let's take a moment and have a look at how this all fits together for Maximo customers.
Right, so to just OpenShift is not new on AWS. We've got the option of managed OpenShift as well as self-managed. How does that fit into the Maximo customer decision here?
Right. So currently, customers have few options for the underlying OpenShift. They have self-managed, which is OpenShift Container Platform, also called as OCP. It's completely self-managed. You purchase it, you deploy it, you manage it, you run it, and you do all the break fix maintenance of it. And then you deploy Maximo on top of that existing environment. This could run on premises. We also see a lot of customers exploring bringing OpenShift and their Maximo workloads to AWS. On AWS, we do have the self-managed version of OCP. Likewise, we also have the managed version on AWS. This is the Red Hat OpenShift service on AWS, also called as ROSA, which is jointly supported by Red Hat and AWS. However, it is managed by Red Hat directly. Now, the managed option, ROSA, is very much attractive for Maximo customers who do not have the required skills or knowledge to manage the OpenShift themselves, or who do not have enough resources to handle the management tasks and just want to focus their resources on other important business areas and let Red Hat handle the heavy lifting for managing the OpenShift platform.
Let's take a second and dive into some of the other features, functions, and benefits of ROSA or managed OpenShift on AWS. Some of this came from customer feedback, and these are some of the things that were baked into the product originally. Tejasvi, can you run us through, the highlights here?
Sure, yeah. So ROSA is a managed OpenShift service. It is directly integrated with the AWS console. So when you go to the AWS console, you will see ROSA listed along with other AWS container services like Amazon ECS and Amazon EKS. Now with ROSA, customers can go to the AWS console, subscribe to the service, and then start the process of deploying an OpenShift cluster. This OpenShift cluster will be managed by Red Hat on behalf of the customer. ROSA also has a unified billing system. Customers can be billed for two things. One, the underlying resources like compute and storage used for the OpenShift implementation. And the second thing is the Red Hat OpenShift subscriptions or licenses needed for the worker nodes or compute nodes. Now, both of these charges will appear as a separate line items on the customer's AWS bill. So customers will see one line item for the infrastructure cost and other line item for the OpenShift subscription cost related to their worker or compute nodes. Since ROSA is jointly supported by AWS and Red Hat, customers have a choice of who to contact for support. They can reach out to either AWS or Red Hat. No matter which one they contact, customers will receive a tier one, that is initial support from both AWS and Red Hat. If needed, both AWS and Red Hat can escalate support cases to each other. This means customers don't have to go back and forth between multiple entities for support.
And then
Those
looking
are
at the management side of things, if we look at that and compare it to something like self-managed OCP, obviously self-managed OpenShift, the customer does everything. With moving to ROSA, Red Hat is responsible for what? What does Red Hat take out of the hands of the customer? The customer no longer needs to worry about.
Um,
I
so
think it's mainly the control plane, the worker nodes, everything that is OpenShift. Is that correct?
yes, that's right.
So really the customer just focuses on the applications or the workloads that they're going to run on top of OpenShift, in this case, Maximo. So when we talk about Maximo support, customers have choice to open up support cases for ROSA or OpenShift to AWS or Red Hat. But for Maximo specific queries, those would be support cases to IBM directly. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, Ryan, that's right.
Let's peel back the onion and have a look at the architecture of OpenShift in a very general sense, and then zoom into what ROSA used to be in the form of a ROSA Classic, and then have a look at something new, ROSA hosted control planes, and see what is changing. And ultimately, we want to peel back the onion and have a look at what is manifesting inside the AWS account for a Maximo customer that's going to deploy ROSA. Tejasvi, we've discussed this quite prevalently, where you've observed the most common implementation is a private link cluster. Quickly run us through what is private link and how does it manifest? What are the core building blocks inside an AWS account? And then we'll go into HCP.
Right. So in private link, the cluster and application workloads are private. It requires to deploy into an existing VPC. When deploying ROSA into an existing VPC, the installer will prompt for subnets to install into. The Red Hat SRE teams will make use of the private link endpoints to access the cluster for management. And then NAT gateways are not present in this implementation. No public subnets, route tables, or internet gateway are required.
So everything private. Again, as with OpenShift, we take the resilience model of OpenShift and we combine that with the resilience model of AWS. So you'll notice that every layer of OpenShift, the control plane, as well as the data plane or the compute layer, has resilience. There are three master nodes, three infrastructure nodes, and in this case, a collection of compute worker nodes. And those are then spread evenly across three availability zones, giving us that high resilience over here. When you deploy Maximo on top of this, Maximo then benefits from that combined resilience. With this all being private, however, there is obviously the challenge of how do I expose Maximo to the rest of my organization, or back to on-premises, or back to other components or entities that need to connect to it. So we would typically see an intermediary networking take place here. We would see some sort of additional security layer. I'll come back and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. But I think the big takeaway here is this is completely private. It cannot be accessed from the outside world unless the customer makes very deliberate architectural decisions in order to expose those workloads. Jumping into hosted control plane. Now, hosted control plane is relatively new. The hosted control plane side of things, obviously, we're going to see a couple of changes to the architecture. And let's quickly talk through some of the benefits here. There are some benefits to reducing the provisioning time. There is a change to how the SREs are managing the environment. You mentioned that previously they were coming in via private link to manage the environment. Uh, Reduction of costs, and I think this is the big one for most customers, is there is a cheaper underlying infrastructure footprint here. So for customers who are running relatively smaller workloads, and like Maximo, where they need to run on top of OpenShift, this becomes a compelling sort of driver. So just talk me through hosted control plane. How is that different from the ROSA classic implementation that we just had a look at?
If you see the new architecture, Ryan, we see that there are two accounts here. One is the service team account, and the other one is the customer account. If you see the control plane is actually moving into the other account, we are also removing the infrastructure nodes. Master is going to move into another account, and the purpose of the private link is to communicate between those two accounts. And also, the SRE teams manages the OpenShift from the service team account.
So essentially, what we've done is from ROSA Classic or a more traditional OpenShift architecture where everything that was OpenShift was deployed into the customer account, and the customer would incur costs for not just the EC2 instances, the attached EBS volumes, the storage, also the inter-AZ data transfer. All of that now, or not all of it, the vast majority of it disappears because we're taking the control plane out of the customer's account. So all of those EC2 instances, all of the related storage, all of the related inter-AZ data transfer that's part of OpenShift is no longer a billable aspect within the customer account. Likewise, the infrastructure layer, some of the components that we're running on the infrastructure nodes, we've moved that into the master nodes in the control plane, into now the service team account. One or two of the functions, most notably the OpenShift routing layer, that has to remain in the customer's account. So we've collapsed that particular routing function onto the compute nodes. And I think the big difference here is this becomes a architecture that's much more similar to what we see with other AWS services like ECS or EKS, where there's a control plane sitting in a control plane account, and then the customer only has the compute layer sitting within their own customer account. So there's a fairly dramatic cost reduction here with those control plane components being moved out of the customer's account and the related data transfer there. Maximo is one of the first IBM products to fully support HCP, which is very exciting. It means that Maximo customers can adopt this and reap the benefits thereof. Again, we've got a public and a private version over here. And again, what we're seeing is that private environment being the more prevalent one being used over here. Let's jump in and talk about some of the things that have been added in as features and functionalities to the managed OpenShift service that are specific to, or maybe critical, important, interesting to Maximo customers. So one of the things that Red Hat and AWS worked very hard on was to ensure that managed OpenShift catered for all of the different instance types that are important to Maximo customers. One of these is obviously catering for instance types that have GPU capabilities. And this is specifically the EC2, P3, and P4 series instance types. This is not going to be used by every single Maximo customer, but if you're a Maximo customer and you're using the predict modules where you're doing predictive failure detection and that runs as an ML workload and it uses a lot of GPU processing, those P3 or those P4 instance types are going to be attractive to you. Something to note over here, the provisioning of these GPU nodes is typically going to be something that you do after you provision your ROSA cluster. So you create the ROSA cluster either through the hybrid console or through the ROSA CLI, but you build out that ROSA cluster. Then you'd go and deploy an additional OpenShift machine pool, and that second machine pool is going to have a different definition of EC2 instances, specifically a GPU capable one here. And then what you can do is then deploy Maximo onto your existing OpenShift and take advantage of that. Looking at that very, very quickly, you can do this graphically by going into the OpenShift hybrid console, adding a machine pool, and you can see over here I've selected that P4D instance and added that to the environment. Again, you can take advantage of auto scaling here. You can take advantage of the spanning multiple availability zones, same capability as all of your other compute nodes in OpenShift. The other element here is with Maximo being containerized and moving to AWS, there is the question of what are the different AWS storage options that are supported by Maximo on OpenShift. We've also done a few things to the OpenShift installer as well as to the Maximo installer to take advantage of AWS storage. So first and foremost, Amazon's Elastic Block Store. These are the virtual machine volumes that would be attached as disks to virtual machines. When you, by default, OpenShift and ROSA as well, will now make use of general purpose 3 or GP3 volumes. This provides customers a lower cost but an increased performance footprint. So you're getting a little bit more bang for buck out of the default configuration of OpenShift. The Maximo installer used to provision everything with high performance dedicated IOPS provisioned disks. These were very expensive. And in many cases, we found that this was a waste for customers because some components of Maximo required that dedicated performance where other components didn't. So what we did is we worked with Red Hat and we worked with IBM and we modified the Maximo default installation. So for components that require high performance throughput on the disk subsystem, the Maximo installer will provision provisioned IOPS IO1 volumes. On other nodes where other components of Maximo don't require that, the Maximo installer will now use standard GP3 disks as with the OpenShift default. So you get that blended approach, best bang for buck for things that just need general purpose storage, but I still have those IO1 dedicated performances, where they are needed. The next thing that we had a look at was shared storage for the Maximo environment. So this is again going to be where we see AWS native services like the Elastic File System being supported by Maximo as well as in OpenShift. EFS is particularly attractive because what it does is it doesn't have EC2 instances that are being dedicated as storage nodes duplicated across 3 availability zones. It doesn't see storage duplicated across 3 environments, and it doesn't use replication in the customer's account to achieve that resilience. Rather, all of that is done in a service team account in the background, and the customer simply gets EFS endpoints. EFS is deployed in OpenShift using a CSI driver and an OpenShift operator. And once the EFS is deployed into OpenShift, the Maximo installer can simply take advantage of that shared storage layer. Maximo on OpenShift also supports third-party storage options. So Portworx is one of those shared storage options that is a third-party supported environment. And recently, IBM launched IBM Storage Fusion. Now, Fusion is now available on the AWS Marketplace. It deploys as an operator installed additional add-on to OpenShift. This is something similar to the older OpenShift Data Foundation or ODF that Red Hat used to sell. But what we have here with Fusion is IBM has added several layers of capability over and above just this being shared storage. So there's a lot of focus around backup recovery, resilience, data protection that come as part of the IBM Fusion product catalog. So when we're talking about Maximo customers and storage, there really are a couple of options here. And what we would do is we would work with the customer to understand, what are they familiar with, what is supported by IBM, and which is going to be the best fit for them. Right now, IBM Fusion is still relatively new, so most of the customers I'm working with are still using Amazon's EFS. With customers who are coming into AWS, they're using AWS as part of their broader modernization strategies and their cloud adoption strategies. Also looking at Maximo, Maximo is going to deploy on top of an existing OpenShift environment, and ROSA is typically going to deploy into an existing VPC. As such, many enterprises are creating repeatable building blocks that are relevant to a customer moving into AWS's Maximo journey. So the first thing that we see is customers are not just arbitrarily going and creating accounts. They're not arbitrarily going and creating network environments. We do see a lot of customers taking advantage of AWS Control Tower, and they're creating repeatable building blocks. So Control Tower gives customers the ability to vend AWS accounts, deploy multiple accounts. So as new teams are coming into AWS, you can literally just vend them a new account from the Control Tower, and that account will be pre-configured with, all of the service limits, the support offerings. It will have all of the control mechanisms that are required for the organization. So what we have here is Control Tower hooking into AWS organizations. And we would typically see Maximo customers deploying multiple accounts, potentially a non-production and a production account. We combine that with infrastructure as code templates to build out the networks and stitch those networks together. So definitely for the larger enterprise customers, there's this pattern of repeatability using AWS Control Tower. Something I alluded to when we touched on the networking architecture, with everything being private with ROSA private link, we do end up with a situation of how do I connect that private network to the rest of my organization and potentially back to on-premises. So another very common architectural pattern is the use of a AWS Transit Gateway. This is a networking routing tool, and it allows for very easy setup of network connectivity between multiple AWS accounts, between multiple AWS VPCs, potentially in the same account or spanning multiple accounts, as well as connectivity to on-premise or other hybrid environments. So in this case, what we've got is a ROSA private VPC, and that is connected to my transit gateway, and my transit gateway is then connected to a egress VPC where the customer can control the entry and exit of data flow into their organization and into their ROSA private environment. Typically, we would see some sort of security layer manifesting in that egress VPC. It's not uncommon to see something like a Palo Alto or various other security tools providing the entry and exit point for the organization's overall network. If we zoom out a bit, again, it's not uncommon for us to see multiple accounts. So you could see a non-production ROSA or a staging ROSA account or a production ROSA account. And if you're deploying Maximo on top, you could see a non-prod and a prod Maximo environments separated. And again, interconnected through these transit gateways to other things within the customer's account, such as egress and ingress VPCs, security layers, connectivity back to shared services such as directory services, DNS. And then, of course, you could very likely see a connectivity back through something like a transit gateway connecting to AWS Direct Connect or a VPN, hooking the AWS environments into the customer's existing on-premises environments or other hybrid architectures. So we mentioned, transit gateways being part of the networking. We mentioned Control Tower coming into the picture. Previously, we touched on private link being very common as a pattern. The other thing that we see is almost default nowadays is ROSA STS, or ROSA making use of the Amazon Secure Token Service. This provides credential cycling as well as temporary credentials for the application workloads. So very, very heightened security. And again, Maximo is taking advantage of this STS component of OpenShift running on top of AWS. While we're on the topic of security, AWS Security's top stack, for most of our customers, Security's top stack, can you quickly run us through what security and compliance accolades ROSA has and how that potentially could differ from ROSA Classic to ROSA HCP, and where does that fit into a Maximo customer's journey?
Sure, Ryan. So, from a security and a compliance perspective, ROSA has several certifications already in place. So, if you're looking at ISO 27001, ISO 2717 and 18, those are already in place certification. Likewise, PCI, DSS, SOC 2 Type 2, SOC 2 Type 3, but it doesn't have FIPS support. For customers who are deploying Maximo in a government regulatory environment, this is typically public sector customers. ROSA is available on AWS GovCloud as well. However, the certifications of FedRAMP, specifically FedRAMP High, that is currently going through that process, and it has a agency ATO. We are anticipating seeing a full FedRAMP High support later. So as you can see, the certification for hosted control plane is already largely there, but the HIPAA and FedRAMP components are going to come at a later stage. Now, for customers in the medical space where HIPAA certification or HIPAA qualification is required, ROSA itself is HIPAA qualified. And what Red Hat has done is everywhere where they have processes that form part of that HIPAA certification, they have documented that. Um, Also, customers that need HIPAA, going through that HIPAA journey, they can reach out to Red Hat and they can request all of that documentation that Red Hat is responsible for the interaction of change control, the interaction of security, their change management process, and they can provide that documentation. The customer would add that to their own documentation when they are going through a HIPAA certification process or qualification process.
And they'd obviously have to add in the Maximo layer of that as part of that certification process. Uh,
Right.
Jasvi, thank you very much for joining me. As always, it is a fantastic pleasure having you here.
Thank you, Ryan. I know there's a lot of information there, but thank you very much. And I hope this was helpful.
As always, you know, we see a lot of IBM workloads being deployed on OpenShift. This session has been largely focused around Maximo. A lot of this information isn't Maximo specific, however. A lot of this could pertain to other IBM software solutions. We've just zoomed in on the ones that are very much Maximo specific. If you do have any additional questions or you want to us to walk you through this, please don't hesitate to reach out to your AWS account team and request them put you in touch with the partner team supporting IBM. Thank you and have a wonderful remainder of your day.